Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're almost out of the woods, but there's still a lot to talk about, so let's dive in. Stake Hammer, a trick weapon of unusual form made by the workshop heretics, the Gunpowder Warehouse, famous as the weapon favored by the old hunter Dura. Drives out a very thick stake with a hammering motion by some strange complex mechanism. A weapon of singular killing blows, the gap between them is large, with a high degree of difficulty in its usability. Of course, that very difficulty is apparently the Gunpowder Warehouse's style. So, the first thing that jumps out at me here is the translation of the final line of this weapon, where the Japanese seems pretty different than the official English. And this actually raises something of a unique issue for me, given what we've seen so far. Because one thing that's become clearer as we've looked at more and more of these translations is that at times there are these odd mismatches where the Japanese text and the official English translation seem to be saying different things. I talked about it in regards to the final lines of the gold pendant in the last episode of Translationborne, and I said then that the more times we run into cases like this, the more I think it's likely that the Japanese text received an editing pass or two after the translation was completed. Given some additional information I'm thinking of making a special video about, I still think that's the best explanation, but it does open up the question of how many issues these changes account for. Some of the changes are fairly obvious, like we saw with the Kirkhammer. Translators don't just make up and rewrite whole sections of the text with no connection to the original, so when the Japanese and English seem to have no relation to one another, I think we're probably looking at the translation of earlier Japanese text that received some subsequent changes. But this particular line almost makes sense to me. Saying that something being difficult to use typifies the powder keg's style, I don't think is that far from saying that a weapon that's hard to use wouldn't bother a powder keg. The thing that really gets me here, though, is the usage of mere. There's nothing in the Japanese that really seems to strike that same denigrating tone. So, was there something there that might have indicated that originally? Or was it some other sort of misinterpretation? I can't really say, though at this point I'm inclined to believe it probably was the result of editing the Japanese text. Either way though, this is an issue we're likely to be seeing more of as we keep going, so I'd like to say now that I'm going to try to remain focused on the effect of these discrepancies when we run into them, rather than endlessly speculate as to how much any given discrepancy is due to what. But I did want to address this before moving on. So having said all that, what's the difference here? Well, again, I think it's down to the usage of that word mere. Both in the English and the Japanese, I think it's possible to get the sense that ease of use isn't a priority for a powder keg, even if the Japanese is a bit more direct. And we already know from the powder keg hunter badge that they adore complex design and big booms. So really, it's just the denigration of a mere powder keg that separates the English from the Japanese here. Finally, on a brief unrelated note, you may have noticed that my pronunciation for the name of the hunter Dura was different than before. That's because, having seen the phonetic Japanese, it's now clear to me the J in his name is pronounced with a European-friendly Y sound rather than the J that I imagined. I think it's interesting that they'd choose that romanization, but speaking of which, why don't we take a look at something else that once belonged to our friend Ludwig? Ludwig's rifle. A rifle used by healing church hunters in particular. Famous for being used by Ludwig, the first hunter of the church. Its long, heavy barrel sacrifices a high rate of fire in favor of increased firing range. The healing church workshop, beginning with Ludwig, gave birth to a different style for hunters than aged Gehrman in order to hunt more frightening beasts, or perhaps strange wonders. And here's another issue we were just talking about. Clearly, this is one of those items where the final section of the description seems to have been changed at some point after the translation was done. Intriguingly, this particular case is where the English arguably gives a bit more information than the Japanese, which is simply a copy of what we saw on Ludwig's Holy Blade. So, what's the effect of this particular discrepancy? Well, despite the additional information that can be gleaned here, I don't think the result is especially significant. The first part of the English line emphasizes that Ludwig's rifle exhibits several departures from the workshop's design. This is something players of the Japanese version of the game can get both from the image and from the shared portion of the description that talks about sacrificing reload speed for increased range. The second part of the official English here is more relevant, analyzing how these differences in design show that the church anticipated larger, inhuman beasts. Someone playing the Japanese version of the game can learn something similar from the repeated text in that it's clear that Ludwig took a different approach that was better adapted to fighting more frightening beasts, or strange wonders, but I'd argue there are a few key differences here. First, I think the simple fact that the English features unique wording gives this information more force. It's very easy to simply gloss over repeated text, and by not having exactly the same wording as before, I would imagine that a player in English is more likely to see this set of lines as a kind of confirmation of the lines used in Ludwig's Holy Blade, rather than a repetition of them. And because it acts as a confirmation, it's also another opportunity for players to connect this with what we learned from the Gold Blood gem, which is that when the church learned its clerics were transforming into the most horrifying of beasts, it needed means of dealing with them. Taken together, it seems the church was having Ludwig come up with ways to specifically deal with the larger inhuman beasts that clerics were turning into. To be fair, I think that's a leap Japanese language players could still make, but I think the unique text of the English makes that connection more likely. Finally, there's the more concrete language here of larger inhuman beasts, as opposed to the less obvious phrasing of more frightening beasts or strange wonders that gets repeated in Japanese. Even taking these differences into account, though, I think the resulting effect of this discrepancy is relatively minor. Interesting how sometimes the smallest changes can have great significance, while at other times fairly large differences result in little of consequence. But since I've just been talking about potential differences between English language and Japanese language players of this game, there's one more quick point I wanted to make in that respect before moving on, because in reality, people who really want to dig into this game have the ability to do so across multiple languages. Since the work itself is something of a hybrid between Japanese and English, it's an angle I think is especially interesting. Here, for instance, is a screenshot of the items page on a Japanese wiki for the game. You'll note, of course, that it contains the English item descriptions as well, similar to the Bloodborne lore translation guide that I found in English that helped inspire me to make this series. So while the average player probably isn't going to dive into cross-linguistic analysis, there are resources out there in both of the game's original languages that will attempt to draw information from either side. It almost makes me feel like in some respects, at the heart, this game is bilingual. I'm not really sure how accurate that is, but at the very least, I think it's important to identify and think over both versions of things, particularly when these discrepancies arise. So, having said all that, I think it's time we checked back in with our friend Valtr. I don't know about you, but having seen some crazy stuff out there, I think I'm ready to join his cult of exterminators. What do you say?
Well then, you've seen enough out there. You fancy joining the ranks of the League?
Yep, sign me up.
Yes, as a hunter well should. Commit this to heart. Our own Carol rune, symbol of the League.
Oh, thanks.
The night brims with defiled scum and is permeated by their rotten stench. Just think, now you're all set to hunt and kill to your heart's content. Hunt in cooperation with your fellows, your League confederates.
Right. Anything else to rant about?
No. There is one thing you must know. By the oath of the League, those who bear its rune will see vermin. Vermin writhe deep within all filth and are the root of man's impurity. All vermin are to be crushed. The League exists to expunge all vermin, ridding us of any trace of human corruption. And so, until we are rid of all vermin, you must continue to hunt and kill. This bloody fate is ours alone. Do not expect the world to grasp our work. But remember, the Confederates will always have my blessing. And each other. Always.
Alright, and from this point on, Valtr will just repeat some of those lines. So to get back to an analysis, I think it's interesting to note once again how well I think the translation is able to convey Valtr's intensity, as well as his devotion to the League. I think you can really see this in the lines he speaks after giving us the League's rune. The night brims with defiled scum and is permeated by their rotten stench. Just think, now you're all set to hunt and kill to your heart's content. Hunt in cooperation with your fellows, your League confederates. The first line is different in formulation from a more literal translation, but the spirit is definitely there. Valtr sees the night to be full of filth of all kinds. He then goes on to revel in its destruction and emphasize the cooperative nature of the task, all in keeping with the spirit of what we've seen so far. And I think the translation really does a good job of bringing out his voice throughout this dialogue. Having noted that as a more general point then, let's get to some specifics. There are a number of terms here that involve creative translation choices, and probably the most prominent of them is the translation of what is literally bug into vermin. Now, the original term being used here is mushi, and it's something of a vague word in Japanese. My Daijisen Japanese dictionary, for instance, lists 9 different senses of the word. The most obviously applicable one is a general term for small living creatures other than humans, beasts, birds, and sea creatures, especially insects. And note that while this definition emphasizes the term is often used to refer to insects, it is not necessarily restricted to them. For that matter, under Merriam-Webster's definition for vermin, lice and fleas are listed as examples. There's something of an overlap between the terms used in both languages here that I think makes the word vermin work. And besides, I think it would be kind of hard to take Valtr seriously if he literally told us our job was to crush all bugs underfoot. But there are a few other definitions of the Japanese term that also seem potentially relevant to Bloodborne, including a term used to describe a variety of illnesses that occur as a result of a child's fragile constitution, a parasite of the human body, often used to describe the intestinal worms of rodents, something thought to influence a person's state of consciousness and/or emotions from inside the body, and, ironically, a person wholeheartedly devoted to one thing. This last one would be something like a bookworm. So there are a few extra layers of meaning in the Japanese that get at the idea of madness, as well as the thought of somehow controlling or sucking the life out of a human being. And if anything, these further meanings only make the choice of the term vermin seem more appropriate to me, since the English word has harmful connotations of its own, as well as the ability to describe an offensive person in addition to insects and animal pests. But I don't only want to talk about bugs and vermin here. There are a few other terms I'd like to look at briefly as well. First, I love the fact that in the Japanese, Valtr literally says the League has its own carol. Not its own carol rune, its own carol. It really does go to show how interchangeable that name is with those runes, and I think it's nice to see information we've read about in an item description, how Carol didn't describe all the runes himself, but just became strongly associated with them, being put into practical use. That said, I don't blame the translators for not having him say that in the English. I think the effect would be somewhat comical and potentially misleading if Valtr were to very seriously say, "Our own Carol, symbol of the League." But I did want to point out that aspect of the Japanese. Finally, I wanted to talk about the usage of the term impurity in place of stagnation in a few of Valtr's lines. Technically, this is a bit of a leap since the original Japanese term yodomi literally refers to a body of stagnant or murky water. But given the context the term is used in here, describing vermin as the source of humanity's stagnation, I think it's just as fitting. And an obsession with purity is well understood as a form of mania in the West, which I think this whole portion of Valtr's speech is very much trying to get players to think of. We're going to have to leave the question of Valtr's obsession there for now, though, as we've reached the end of another episode. I'll try to get out that special on the changed Japanese lines soon, but in the meantime, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I would love to hear them. As always, thanks for watching, everyone.